You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
And half a day. My name is Dr. Mary Therese Ratori, Interim Director of the East-West Center's Pacific Islands Development Program, and I'm happy to welcome you all here. I'm a native Chamorro of the island of Guam and convey warm greetings and aloha from the East-West Center on the island of Oahu, from the Ahu Pua'a of Waikiki in the Ili of Puhia, and acknowledge with gratitude and respect the ancestral lands of the Kanaka Maoli, the indigenous people of Hawaii. I am honored to be joined by an accomplished and distinguished panel, most who are actually on the East Coast. And before they begin, I want to give you the overview of today's program. This is a three-part program that starts with a presentation from representatives of the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, and is then followed by remarks and insights from representatives of two Compact of Free Association nations, Ambassador Gerald Zacchios from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Mr. Jackson Sorum, Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of the Federated States of Micronesia. And the third part of the program is Q&A. So I'd like to now pass the mic to Ms. Letitia Love, Director of International Affairs and Trade of the GAO office, who will introduce us to her colleagues and get the program started. Thank you, Letitia.
Thank you so much. And thank you and welcome to everyone who has joined us today. Good day from wherever you are, whatever time zone you're representing. As was mentioned, my name is Letitia Love. I am a director in our International Affairs and Affairs Trade team in the Government Accountability Office. And just to give a little bit of background about the Government Accountability Office, for those who may not be familiar with the GAO, we're an investigative arm of Congress. We're an independent federal agency within the legislative branch that evaluates the effectiveness, the efficiency, and just the federal programs and policies that other agencies are charged with implementing. And we also evaluate emerging issues that Congress needs to be able to understand in order to implement their important oversight role. So our clients are congressional members. And in the work that we do, we may make recommendations to federal agencies to improve their programs or their policies, their operations, their oversight, or we may make matters or raise issues for Congress to consider related to legislative changes that may be needed or warranted based on the work that we've done. So the group that my colleagues and I represent within GAO examines international affairs and trade issues. And of course, an important part of that, as we think about what's happening right now, are the negotiations of the compacts that are happening. That's a very important topic to congressional members. And they have been interested in understanding the many facets of these compacts for some time now, not just right at this very moment, but even in 2018, we were asked to conduct a review looking at the different aspects of the compact in order to inform congressional members. And that work that we conducted in 2018, we identified a few themes that we thought were really important to highlight, including some very important issues related to the structure of the compact fund. And that structure of those issues you'll see permeate the discussion that we're going to have today, because we continue to find that those were important issues to highlight in the report that we've just issued in 2022. So we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, but I want to give you a teaser on that. Today we were asked to just share with you what we were able to identify, discuss, examine in the report that we've issued in 2022. And as my colleague will pull up our slides, I'll talk to you about what we were asked to examine. So for this review, Congress asked the GAO to assess or examine the use and the role of U.S. funds and programs in the country's budgets. And in the countries, we mean by the compact nations. They also asked us to examine the projected federal effects of the ending of compact grants and certain programs and services, as well as the record of accountability for the use of funds. And so we have, for the review that we're going to talk about today, those are the three objectives that we have covered and that we will discuss in great detail. And also just a little bit of context on this, there are a range of federal agencies that are involved in these compacts. And just to name a few, there's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Health and Human Services, Department of Education, Department of Interior, State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Postal Service, the National Science Foundation, Department of Commerce, the Federal Aviation Administration, and others. So there's a wide range of federal agencies that play a role in the compacts, and it's important to really understand the range of programs and grants that they provide, as well as the effects of those programs and grants potentially ending. And so we'll talk about that in greater detail. If we can move on to the next slide. For those who might not be familiar, we wanted to provide just a little bit of background on these compacts. So the U.S. entered into the compacts, in particular with FSM and RMI in 1986 and amended them in 2003. They entered into another compact with Palau in 1994 and entered into a compact review agreement in 2018. There are some similarities between these compacts, but there are also some differences that we'll talk about today that are important to highlight. But through the compacts, you should be aware there's a variety of assistance and services that are provided. The U.S. has responsibility for defense and security matters. It allows freely associated state citizens to enter, reside, and work in the U.S. It provides economic assistance in the form of grants and programs and services. And there are, again, some variations in which services are provided between the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Marshall Islands, and Palau. We'll talk about what those are. And we also make contributions to each country's compact trust fund. And that's intended to provide long-term budgetary support after the compact assistance ends. So certain provisions of the compacts are set to expire. And especially in 2023, that's for FSM and RMI, many of the services we're going to talk about today are expected to expire. And we want to talk about just the impact of those expiring on the budgets of these countries. And after 2024, the compacts will also, some of the services under the compacts will also expire for Palau. So with that, I want to turn it over to the team who did all of the hard work on this, examining these issues, and they will go in great detail about what we found and some of the issues that we have identified as really needing congressional and federal agencies' attention. And just to introduce those members to you, I have my colleague, Andrea Miller, who was the analyst in charge for this work, who will kick us off. Also, my colleague, Jeff Isaac, who is our internal control specialist, and my colleague, Dr. Mark Rockmore, who is the economist who worked with us on this job. So I hope that you will take notes so that you can have many questions to ask us at the end, because we'd really like to engage in a dialogue with you about what we plan to cover. With that, I will pass it on over to Andrea to get us started.
Thank you, Letitia. So to provide a little bit more background information on the U.S. compact assistance to FSM, RMI, and Palau, the U.S. provides assistance in the form of compact sector grants, which support FSM and RMI in education, health, infrastructure, environment, private sector development, and public sector capacity building. In addition, assistance under the compacts is provided to FSM and RMI for financial audits and emergency management, among other things. Palau does not receive assistance in the form of compact sector grants, but does receive infrastructure maintenance grants and other grants under its compact. The FSM and RMI also receive a supplemental education grant, which supports direct educational services at the local school level and includes programs originally provided by the Department of Education and Labor that were replaced by the supplemental education grant. Through the compacts, the freely associated state countries, the 3 countries, also receive assistance in the form of programs and services. These include services such as FEMA disaster assistance and response, the postal, aviation, weather, and telecommunication services. In addition, services for FSM covers federal deposit insurance for the Bank of FSM, as well as judicial training for FSM and RMI. And as Letitia previously mentioned, the U.S. contributes to each country's compact trust fund, which are intended to provide long-term support after the compact assistance ends. And this is in particular important for when the compact sector grants end for the FSM and RMI in 2023. So this slide shows a graphic that is in our report and includes a great bit of detail about the FSM and RMI trust fund structure and the disbursement process. As there is not a lot of time to go over the complex graphic in detail, I will cover the highlights of the trust fund structure and disbursement. To start, the FSM and RMI's compact trust fund consists of 3 interrelated accounts. You have the corpus account, A account, the buffer account, which is the C account, and the disbursement account, which is the B account, which is to be created at the beginning of fiscal year 2023. The corpus account contains the initial and any additional US and FSM and RMI contributions from subsequent contributors and investment earnings. Through fiscal year 2022, any annual investment income exceeding 6% of the fund balance is deposited into the buffer account. And then starting in fiscal year 2023, all investment income will be deposited in the disbursement account for possible disbursement in fiscal year 2024. And each subsequent year's investment income from the corpus account will be deposited in the disbursement account for possible disbursement after. When we discuss objective 2, a few slides later, we will get into more detail about the disbursements for the FSM and RMI. So by contrast, the Palau Compact Trust Fund was designed to be a sinking fund and provide revenue only until fiscal year 4045. The figure on the slide shows the current disbursement structure for Palau's Compact Trust Fund. And you'll see it's quite less complicated than the structure, the trust fund structure for FSM and RMI. The current maximum allowable annual disbursements from the Compact Trust Fund for Palau is 15 million, which Palau has been taking already. So as long as the balance of the Compact Trust Fund is greater than or equal to the 15 million, Palau can receive the maximum allowable annual disbursement. If the balance were less than 15 million, there would be a single year with a partial disbursement. For each of the 3 countries, I'll now talk about our findings related to the use and role of funds in each country's budget. For all countries, we found that US assistance provides a substantial percentage of the country's budget expenditures for programs, specifically up to about 1/3 total. And for our methodology, we used single audit reports for each freely associated state country to derive the data and reported on the most recent available data in our scope, which was fiscal years 2015 through fiscal year 2019. So starting with the FSM, we found that in fiscal year 2019, the total expenditures of the FSM national and state governments was 232.7 million. And then of that total, 83 million or 36% was supported by US assistance. You will see 24% representing compact sector grants that are ending in 2023. And these in particular are made up heavily from health and education sectors from the compact sector grants. You'll also see that 4% represent supplemental education grants, and these are also ending in 2023. And the value of these expenditures was about 65 million combined with the compact sector grants mentioned earlier. You'll see 8% represents other US grants, about 18 million that are not ending. And these were examples of US assistance that Letitia mentioned earlier that covered grants from Department of Agriculture, Health and Human Services, to name a few. And the FSM also receives assistance specified under its Programs and Services Agreement, and these are not reflected in the expenditure data that is represented here in this pie chart. And the agreement for the Programs and Services Agreement for FSM is set to expire in September 30th, 2023, but some of the programs and services could continue under other authorities. So continuing on to the RMI slide, we found that in fiscal year 2019, the total expenditures of the RMI government was 164.8 million. And of that total, 56 million or 36% was supported by US assistance. You'll see that 17% representing compact sector grants, and these are ending in 2023. And similar to the FSM slide, the health and education sectors represented the largest portion of the compact sector grants. You'll see 3% representing supplemental education grants, supplemental education grant that is ending in 2023. And the value of the expenditures was about 34 million with the compact sector grants combined. Another 7% representing Kwajalein related grants, and these do not end in 2023. And these are under the Military Use and Operating Rights Agreement, eBay Special Needs and Kwajalein grants. These were about 11 million. And just to mention, this figure does not include the 18 million annually partially inflated adjusted provided to the RMI government to compensate for Kwajalein atoll and landowners for the use of the atoll by the US. Another 7% representing other US grants, and these are not ending, and these were valued at about 11 million, covering categories from funding from agencies such as the Department of Agriculture, environmental monitoring programs for nuclear affected areas, and public health programs. And as previously mentioned, RMI also receives assistance under its Programs and Services Agreement, and this agreement is set to expire in 2024. These cover items such as postal, weather, aviation, as previously discussed. Moving on to the slide on Palau. In fiscal year 2019, the total expenditures of the Palau government was 129 million. And of that total, 32 million or 26% was supported by US assistance. Unlike the FSM and RMI, very little is coming from compact grants as far as US assistance, only about 1. And this represents infrastructure projects or funds such as maintenance of roads in Palau, and covers a little over $1 million of assistance provided. You'll see the 12% represents disbursements from the Palau Compact Trust Fund, so the 15 million that Palau is already taking in disbursements. Another 13% represents other US grants provided by a number of US agencies, and this is about 16 million, and these grants are not ending. Similarly to FSM and RMI, Palau also receives assistance specified under its Programs and Services Agreements that are set to expire in 2024, and these are not represented in the pie chart that is up on the screen. And these services are generally the same assistance as those provided for FSM and RMI. Did want to mention that Palau does not receive disaster assistance services through FEMA that FSM and RMI do receive. So this completes the presentation of Objective 1. I will now pass it over to my colleague Mark to discuss Objective 2.
Thank you, Andrea. So I want to talk about two parts. First, I want to talk about the fiscal gaps, which would emerge after the end of assistance. And then I'm going to turn to the projections for the compact trust funds. To estimate the fiscal gaps, what we did is we considered only the assistance which was included in budgets as reflected by the single audits. So in terms of this chart, these are the US grant assistance, the FSM, the $93 million. The $16 million in services that will be ended were not included in the budgets and are therefore not counted towards potential fiscal gaps, but will likely have a further economic impact. So the crucial idea here is that we think that, or rather we find that for FSM and RMI, I'm going to group the two of them together due to similarity, the fiscal gaps will emerge after the end of the grants in fiscal year 2023. And this is because the US grant assistance, those $93 million, is composed of two parts, as Andrea noted. They're the compact sector grants and the other grants. And the disbursements, the maximum allowable disbursements, which begin in fiscal year 2024, are tied only to the compact sector grants adjusted for inflation. That is, they don't include the other grants. Consequently, the disbursements are necessarily smaller than the value of the total grants which are ending. So to put this in perspective, out of those $93 million in grants to the FSM, roughly 12 million of that are not compact grants and are therefore not included in the calculation of the maximum allowable disbursement. And this is in addition to the $16 million roughly in services that are ending, which are also not counted towards the fiscal gap. If you could move to the next slide, please, Andrea. We have a similar story when we look at the RMI. That is out of the roughly $33 million in grant assistance received from the United States, roughly roughly 6 million are not compact sector grants and are therefore not included when we calculate the total disbursement levels that are allowable. And then in addition, there's also the $7 million in services roughly. So again, for both countries, what we have is a fiscal gap that will emerge necessarily because the disbursement levels are tied to the compact grant assistance, which is expiring and does not cover all the grants. We have a slightly different story for Palau. If you could just switch, thank you. So in Palau, what happens is the fiscal gap is going to be due to the end of an infrastructure maintenance grant in 2024. This grant funded an infrastructure maintenance trust fund, which will be replacing the grant or could replace the grant. Once that trust fund is depleted, then Palau will similarly face a fiscal gap. And here, what we see is that there's roughly 3 million in services and 2 million in grants overall. So again, for all three countries, what we see is a fiscal gap that will be emerging. For FSM and RMI, that will emerge immediately, and for Palau, that will emerge over time. So turning now to the next section, if you could just move the slides forward, thank you. I want to talk about the results of our compact trust fund simulations, where we use a Monte Carlo estimation to estimate what would happen in the future based on certain parameters. So before talking through this, I want to provide some intuition for the results. And we're going to find that the results for FSM and RMI are going to be very similar given the structures of their compact trust funds. And I just want to go back a little bit to what Andrea had talked about. So the disbursement levels depend on the investment income from the previous year from the corpus. And then if that is not sufficient to get up to the amount that they want to take, each country, then the buffer fund is used to make up that difference. However, given a series of bad years, so by bad I mean with lower negative returns, this buffer count can get depleted and eventually can actually go down to zero, in which case then the disbursements would only depend on investment incomes. So were that to happen, in years that have lower returns, then countries would not be able to withdraw their maximum allowable. And there's also the risk that there are years in which there would be no disbursement, despite there being money in the corpus. So we've made several assumptions to generate these estimates. These are in the report, and I'm happy to discuss them. I would first note that we are assuming that countries are withdrawing the maximum allowable amount in each year, which, as I noted, was based on the magnitude of the compact funds adjusted for inflation. And secondly, we've made an assumption about what are the returns in each year. So we've estimated returns of 6.5%. However, I would note that we find qualitatively similar results in the report as we shift that range up to 8%. So the actual numbers will shift, but qualitatively we'll find very similar results. So again, the key idea here, and we'll see this to some extent with FSM, and we'll see this with RMI, is that the corpus levels, that is the total amount of money that is in the A account, while it is important, in itself is not sufficient to determine whether there'll be a disbursement. So turning now to these results, I want to start on the top left in the green and then move towards the right. So the top left talks about what is the projected average disbursement in each decade for the next 4 decades. So this is saying that in the first one, in 2024 to 2033, we project that FSM will only be able to withdraw on average 85% of the maximum allowable disbursement. And that'll be decreasing in each decade until the final decade, where it's only about 25% of the maximum allowable disbursement. The chart on the top right, which is in dark blue on my screen, then gives a sense about what is that magnitude, right? So how much is the shortfall in those years? So as we can see, is over time, corresponding to the top left, the top right is increasing. That is, there's a greater and greater shortfall. So this is saying that earlier we had noted that there would be a fiscal gap under the maximum allowable disbursement. This is knowing that FSM will actually most likely not be getting that maximum allowable disbursement as years go by. In the bottom half of the panels, we look at, in some case, what's a worst case scenario, or what might be considered that, which is what's the likelihood that there's a year in each decade in which there is zero disbursement, right? And this would occur when the buffer fund has been exhausted. And what we see is that this rises from 36% in the first decade of there being at least 1 year to 92% in the last decade, right? That there is at least 1 year in which there is zero disbursement. And this is despite the fact that even though the compact trust fund balances, we project them to be decreasing, they're still relatively substantial, right? And as we noted, this is based on the structure of how withdrawals are made. We see a very similar set of results when we turn to the RMI, if you could, Andrea, where the RMI has a slightly better fiscal position, at least in terms of the compact trust funds. We see that their projected average disbursements are decreasing, right, relative to the maximum, but are better than the FSMs. And again, on the top right, we see what's the projected shortfall. Despite their relatively better position in the top half, we still see in the bottom half a likelihood of having zero disbursements within any given decade, rising from roughly 1 in 10 to 1 in 2 in the last decade. And crucially, this is despite a projection that the compact trust fund balances are actually going to be increasing over the period. So that is based on the structure of the disbursements and the fact that it has to come from last year's investment income and the buffer fund, that this can occur despite increasing levels in the compact trust fund. Lastly, I'd like to turn to Palau, which has a somewhat different structure, as Andrea noted. And Palau essentially is, so long as there's money in the trust fund, money can be withdrawn. There is a maximum allowable amount, but they can continue to withdraw money. So in that sense, there isn't this rule dictating that it's based on last year's. The big difference here is that once there is a zero disbursement, right, then there is no more compact trust fund. There is not a subsequent year in which there are positive results, and then you can have disbursements as we have for FSM and for RMI. And what we see is that we project that in the first decade, that Palau will be able to withdraw their full maximum amounts, and that'll be decreasing over time, the average amount that they would be able to withdraw, and that the likelihood in the bottom left of zero disbursements will also be rising over time. So this is not saying that there will be, but this is saying that the likelihood of there being at least 1 year will be increasing to roughly 35%. And this is despite us projecting a positive and growing compact trust fund balance. So I'm going to turn this now over to Jeff to talk about the audits. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Leticia had mentioned before, that this section is related to the accountability record of the Federated States of Micronesia, Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. And as the top line says, this is selected information from the single audits. And Angie had mentioned before, a lot of the information she had and her information came from the single audits. So just let me briefly go over what's a single audit for non-accounting people. At a single audit, it's mandated, it's required by the Single Audit Act for any non-federal entity that expends more than $750,000 a year. So you would be required to have an independent audit of your funds, and also of your, as the first item on the left, of your the annual financial statements. So the auditors come in on an annual basis and audit the financial statements, and they express their opinion. As you see, this is for the FSM, national government in the 4 states, and it's collectively, that's why there's numbers by the side of the U, Q, and A. For 2019, it was two unmodified opinions, 2 qualified opinions, and 1 adverse opinion. Just briefly, in terms of an unmodified opinion is a good opinion, that they didn't find any material misstatements. Qualified opinion is an opinion where they found a certain issue and they report that issue. And an adverse opinion is an opinion where the financial statements are considered misleading. There's another opinion called a disclaimer, which is not included here. That's where the auditors do not want to express any opinion at all because the records are generally very poor. Another item in the single audit report is the auditors determine the compliance with requirements of major federal programs, and his opinions on what they deem as a major federal program. Again, for the FSM, it's generally the unmodified opinions are 2 and the qualified opinions are 3. Another aspect, what's included in the single audit report is audit findings. That means that the auditors are looking for compliance or looking for support for an expenditure and they're unable to find it. And that they write up the description of what happened and related weaknesses. So for this 5-year period, the audit findings stayed pretty much the same, little better, went from 23 audit findings in fiscal year 2015 to 19 in fiscal year 19. One other aspect that during when the auditors are performing their audit, they may identify question costs. And a question cost is where there's could be a violation of law, or a certain cost is not supported by adequate documentation, or an auditor may think the cost is considered unreasonable. So each year, and at the end of each year, there were still outstanding question costs for the FSM. Next slide. And this is similar. There's other information in single audit reports, but we decided to try to minimize it. There's a lot of information in those reports to keep it to the same items. So for the Marshall Islands, they've had unmodified opinions, so that's a good opinion for all 5 years. In terms of the compliance with requirements for major federal programs, there's been some issues that they've had, not total compliance with the grant agreements. And they've had, fortunately, in the last 5 years, a reduction from 20 audit findings to 7 audit findings. But the auditors are still finding question costs, and there's still outstanding question costs at the end of each year. Next slide. Then for the Republic of Palau, again, for the financial statement reporting, they have unmodified opinions for the last 5 years. Again, they have qualified opinions on their compliance with the grant agreements and provisions of law, one aspect or another. And then the audit findings too, fortunately, have decreased from 18 to 7 over the period of time. They have also, the auditor identified question costs related to their programs. Next slide. One thing that is important, for all organizations is have an oversight mechanism. And for the the Federated States of Micronesia, they have a mechanism called the Joint Economic Management Committee, called GEMCO. And they provide oversight of the U.S. compact funds, ensuring they're used appropriately and their intended goals, and that the financial controls are in place to support accountability. As well as the Republic of the Marshall Islands, they have the Joint Economic Management Financial Accountability Committee, called GEMFAC, and they have a similar role in oversight of the compact funds. The Palau, back in 2018, the Palau Compact Review Agreement had a provision to establish an advisory group on economic reform between the United States government and Palau. The purpose of the group was recommending economic, financial, and management reforms and provide a schedule for implementing these reforms. During the period of time of our audit, this group had not been constituted, but they had been taking steps towards this group, and we can see here, like I said, that in September 2018, the agreement was they agreed to forming this committee. Then in June 2019, U.S. and Palau each designated their resident members. Then the government of Palau asked the U.S. government for a procedural change in January of 2020. So the United States didn't respond to their request. Then, also in that period of time, the United States and Palau had not established a timetable to select the fifth member. In January 2022, Palau did submit the names of 3 candidates for consideration as a fifth non-resident member. Presently, the group is expected to terminate in September 2023, unless both countries determine that they want to extend the group further. And right as of now, they haven't set a timetable for establishing this group. Thus, in terms of looking, in terms of the lack of constituting this group, next slide, please. That we provided a recommendation that the Secretary of State, working with the Department of Interior, should establish timeframes with milestones to constitute the Palau Advisory Group on Economic Reform for its 2023 termination date. The Department of State concurred with our recommendation and stated that it would seek to establish a timeframe of coordination with the Department of Interior and the government of Palau to constitute the Palau Advisory Group on Economic Reform, consistent with the Compact Review Agreement as amended. Then we also, I don't know if Mark, this part in terms of, I don't know, Andrea, this relates to the issues that we've had in terms of the disbursements that we've had. Well, we have previous recommendation on this in terms of establishing rules related to the how they're dispersing funds and what limitations they have. I don't know if we want to elaborate on that at all.
Okay. I'm happy to, if Jeff, just to note that, yes, as I mentioned at the onset of the discussion in 2018, we did make a recommendation, and that recommendation was to develop a distribution policy for FSM and RMI's compact trust fund that would take into account some strategies that could address the risks that we identified to the ability to provide income in the future. One of the things we may not have said is that FSM and RMI's compact trust fund was intended to be one of those funds that continues into perpetuity. So it's intended to last over time. A little bit like an endowment, you might think of how those are funded. But the RMI, or excuse me, the Palau's trust fund was intended to be a sinking fund. So it wasn't intended to last, into perpetuity. And so we didn't make that recommendation for Palau, but for FSM and RMI, we previously recommended that they take a look at the structure to ensure that basically this trust fund could implement and could be implemented in a way that achieved the goals that were intended. We reiterated that recommendation in 2021 in our priority recommendation letter to the Department of Interior. They have agreed with the recommendation and have noted that they plan to implement it as a part of these negotiations. We keep that recommendation open until those changes are actually implemented, which is why we still have an open recommendation on this point. So that's the sort of gist of where that recommendation stands. And I think we are turning it back over, unless my colleagues have something else to add there, back over to our host to move us on to maybe our questions or to some responses from representatives from the FAS.
Thank you so much, Letitia. Thanks also to Andrea, Dr. Rockmore, Dr. Isaacs, and the GAO for this report and informative presentation. We do have some questions, but I'd like to hold off on the questions and first turn the mic over to our colleagues representing the Republic of the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia. And first, I'll invite Ambassador Zacchaeus of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to share some of his responses and insights. Ambassador Zacchaeus, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ratori. It is my honor and privilege to join with you today for this timely discussion of the Compacts of Free Association and of the recent Government Accountability Office report. I would like to thank the East-West Center for hosting this discussion and Dr. Love and the GAO and their team for their presentation. The government of the Republic of the Marshall Islands has always held the GAO in high regard for its objective and professional work on the different aspects of our relationship with the United States under the Compact of Free Association, even where we may differ with its conclusion at times. It has been a pleasure for me to be able to engage with the GAO, and I would acknowledge retiring members of the GAO, Dr. David Kutnick and Dr. Emil Freeberg, but also with others present today. Over the years, as we work to create a factual record that is accurate and complete, and exchange ideas about the best way forward without bias or preconceived opinion. We are immensely grateful for the GAO's involvement in the compacts and the obvious extensive effort that has been made to produce this report. In this and past investigations, GAO has always been thorough and diligent in consulting all sides and providing opportunities for us to connect. GAO has served to illuminate and explain important issues facing all freely associated states, which is of great value to those involved and helps us to achieve the best outcomes possible. Illustrative of this is in the current report, our GAO's valuation of seizing federal programs and services and the sophisticated approach to modeling the range of potential trust fund future balances and distributions. Both are non-trivial exercises and are highly pertinent and valuable in guiding discourse. In particular, the GAO's modeling of their trust fund highlights the risk that without compact renewal, during some years, the fund will not be able to distribute enough to replace the seizing grants. It also illustrates the potential volatility of distribution under the current trust fund agreement rules. In fact, GAO's projection indicate a risk that no distribution will be made in some years, as has been said. These risks will grow as the fund progresses further into its distribution phase. Similar studies by the USDA Grad School and the Asian Development Bank also have concluded this. The RMI is deeply concerned about such risks. Any lapse in the healthcare and education services that will be financed by fund distribution will be both economically and socially damaging. In addition, any reduction in distributions will create a negative economic shock, affecting private sector activity. We appreciate the Geo Report as a professional and objective source of due diligence monitoring of the risk of distributions. Sadly, however, the report will not have as much impact as it should. An appropriate avenue of dissemination for due diligence monitoring of this sort is the Trust Fund's annual report, which is required to include a section assessing the fund's effectiveness to accomplish its purpose. However, no annual report of the fund includes analysis, such as in the GAO report. Last year, RMI members insisted that the key results of such outside analysis be included in the 2020 annual report. However, the US committee majority prevented the RMI from participating in finalizing an approval of report. Later, RMI members introduced 2 committee resolutions in response. The first would have included links on the trust fund website to the GAOs and other externally sourced analysis of the fund, along with a copy of the trust fund agreement itself. The second would have required that voting by email be done in accordance with the fund's bylaws and the trust fund agreement, which were breached during the approval of the annual report. The US members and majority voted against these resolutions. This year, the updated analysis of the fund in the current Geo report was particularly timely and a great opportunity to have these concerns explained within the annual report for FY 2021. However, the US members again used their majority to prevent even a summary of the GAO analysis from being included. This chain of events is highly discouraging, but consistent with past trust fund committee actions. The committee's RMI members have repeatedly proposed amendments to the trust fund agreement to make the fund work better or to simply conform to facts. All have been rejected. In addition, there has been no effort by US members to address the RMI's concerns and possible fiscal crisis in the future, including $0 distributions in future years. Regretfully, the committee has become a venue where RMI voices are not respected, but rather silenced and outvoted. Given the RMI's treatment within the committee, a particularly disturbing scenario is if the committee were to be left responsible for all the important trust fund distribution policy post-2023. The distribution policy will affect the volatility and distribution, as well as the level of sustainability of distributions. It deals with various trade-offs, among which US and RMI have different priorities. US members have already shown their willingness to use their majority to suppress due diligent monitoring or distribution concerns. If given the chance, they would definitely outvote the RMI's distribution preferences. The only way that RMI and US needs can be appropriately balanced is if distribution policy is addressed in compact negotiations and not preempted by a committee resolution. We note that in their 2018 report, the GAO recommended that the committee should establish a distribution policy as required by the trust fund agreement. However, circumstances have been changed. Both that report and the trust fund agreement were produced before the announcement of renewed compact discussions and negotiation. That bilateral setting is now the only appropriate venue for distribution policy decisions. However, the committee majority also has asked the fund investment advisor to prepare post-2023 distribution formula scenarios. The RMI minority objected for several reasons. The most fundamental is that described above. The request may be an effort to unilaterally impose the committee's majority position, circumventing the bilateral free association negotiations, in which US assistance and trust fund will be a major issue. Further, relying solely on a service provider hired by the committee majority without consultation and independent analysis of its recommendation, of course, raises concerns and questions. Among the reasons for this are that all communication between service providers and the committee must go through our executive administrator, who reports directly to the committee chair. This is despite the fact that the fund's advisor and executive administrator are paid from the fund. It is clear that the committee requires a radical change in approach, and the trust fund agreement requires significant amendments for the fund to be managed fairly and transparently, and as said, in perpetuity. This is supported by the fund's recent external evaluation conducted by RVK, an investment consulting firm. RVK's recommendation included holding a governance training session at which issues such as chair and vice chair responsibilities, voting procedures, and the balance of committee votes would be addressed. They also recommended a number of changes intended to improve committee communications and transparency. Their report also corroborated GAO and other analysis regarding the risk of decline of the trust fund balance and ability to make distribution of the target amount. The trust fund is of immense importance to the people of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. To fulfill its role as a key pillar of our economy, it must be trusted by the Marshallese people. And for it to be trusted, the committee cannot ignore, suppress, and silence our concern. The government of the RMI has voiced its profound disappointment in the committee's majority content, and that status quo is unacceptable. Respect, equitable treatment, and transparency in decision-making is important to the RMI's committee members and the RMI as a whole. Unfortunately, the fund has become less of a partnership and more of a purely US institution that dictates outcome rather than trying to seek concerns in a transparent manner. Given the situation, the RMI government has been forced, and I will use the word forced, to seek other avenues to express its concerns. As a first step, a letter outlining these issues was sent recently to the United States Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. RMI has worked hard to make the fund successful and is proud of its growth. We accept larger decrements in the sector grant assistance in return for larger increments to fund contributions. We brought in Taiwan as an additional contributor. Other contributors would have joined as well if it was not for concerns about US holding majority voting rights. Nevertheless, despite all the troubles, tensions, and disagreements, RMI remains firmly and strongly committed to the goals of the trust fund and the importance of our bilateral relationship with the US and how better to build the strength of this partnership. We believe trust fund governance and trust fund agreement can be improved through compact negotiation. The RMI also believes that accountability provisions and the GEMF Act need major changes. The current fiscal agreement and GEMF Act have not resulted in better education and health outcomes as was promised and expected when the amended compact took effect. Moreover, the US has deviated in implementing the Fiscal Procedures Agreement, where its provisions differ from US federal grant rules. This has caused further confusion and difficulty for RMI government personnel in not knowing what rules apply in certain situations. The GEMFAC US members have also acted in ways that have harmed the RMI by ignoring RMI priorities. An example is a US majority action in a consensus GEMFAC in 2010, prohibiting the RMI from using compact sector grants or funds or supplementary education grant funds to support school lunches. Several years after the imposition of this GEMFAC action, the World Bank and UNICEF published studies indicating malnutrition and stunted growth in Marshallese school-age children. The RMI believes that the ongoing micromanagement of economic assistance must cease, as I had indicated in my September 2019 statement to Congress, while assuring the accountability that both governments and our people demand. The 20-year period of grant assistance under the amended compact will end at the close of FY 2023, and therefore economic assistance is scheduled to take the form of distribution of income from the compact trust fund that has built up since 2004 when it was created. We are optimistic that President Biden's appointment of Ambassador Joseph Yoon as Special Envoy to compact negotiations, who is empowered to discuss all issues, will resolve this impasse and that things can move forward in strength together. The RMI has encouraged this action for over a year now because there are issues that our public is demanding that we discuss. This includes unresolved and ongoing related issues of the nuclear testing program in the Marshall Islands. These issues alone make negotiations on the RMI compact more difficult, but cannot be put up again. The future of our association and strengthening our association includes addressing the nuclear testing legacy, its consequences, climate change, fraudulent, among other issues. I thank you for your time, and I conclude my remarks and look forward to engaging further in the Q&A session. Komaldara, thank you again.
Komaldata, thank you, Ambassador Zacchaeus, for those insightful remarks. And I look forward to the Q&A discussion portion that will follow. Before that, I'd like to invite Mr. Jackson Sorum, Deputy Chief of Mission for the Embassy of the Federated States of Micronesia, to share his remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Ratori. And I'm honored to be here speaking at this forum. I'm especially grateful to East West Center for the invitation to be part of these discussions. Grateful to also see familiar faces, Director Love and your GAO team, Andrew Miller, whom I've worked with closely on this report, Ambassador Zacchaeus, Dr. Ratori, and the rest of the members of the panel. My greetings to all of you in my vernacular Chugis, Renalim. Regrettably, I know the invitation was meant for Ambassador Susaya, but he's on his way to Micronesia for other duties, and he's not here, so I will sit in on his behalf. My remarks are going to be short, and I will just keep it as that, and hopefully I can be able to further engage in discussions through Q&A. Let me firstly try to reflect on the relations between US and the FSM. The United States and the Federated States of Micronesia have a long-standing strategic partnership that reflects the common values of our two countries, including our commitment to promoting the rule of law, democracy, and regional security. And as has been discussed, in 1986, the FSM and the US entered into a compact of free association. That 1986 compact was renewed and amended with the entry into force of the 2003 amended compact of free association, which remains in effect today. These agreements have served both governments extremely well and act as the bedrock for security throughout the Pacific region. The FSM is grateful for US sector grants assistance under the compact, as has been presented by the colleagues from the GAO, as well as US assistance by way of key programs and services under the compact and other US laws. These assistance are essential for the stability of our economy and for the well-being of our people. And as I have said, my remarks will be short, and primarily because our government is currently in talks with the United States about the levels of assistance for the upcoming compact period. And I will not get into details here, but I would only say that we have had very productive initial conversations with the United States, and I'm appreciative of the positive tone of our dialogue, most recently under the leadership of Special Presidential Envoy Ambassador Joseph Yun, as referenced by Ambassador Zacchaeus. The FSM and the United States are also discussing possible ways to update and improve the compact agreement. In this regard, the FSM hopes to reach agreement with the United States on all of these issues in the near future. We share the goal announced by the United States of concluding our negotiations in the upcoming months, We have much work to do, but we believe we will conclude the work successfully, given the importance of these issues and the great spirit of cooperation and collaboration between our two governments now. I will close with that and be available for Q&A. But before I do so, let me just join Ambassador Sakias in also thanking the GAO for the partnership that we've had. As Ambassador has alluded to, the reports that coming out from GAO are always productive and always helpful. And in particular, this one, this couldn't have come at a better time as we prepared for the ending of the current compact and move on to the negotiations for the next future compact. With that, I thank you.
Kinisu Chapur, Mr. Sorum, for sharing your insights and responses to the report. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions so far. The Q&A box is still open. We do have a number of questions, so I'm going to move right into that. And also want to note before that our colleagues at the GAO will be providing this PowerPoint presentation for us, and we will make it available through the East West Center's webpage, through the event page for this webinar, as well as through our social media. And I want to start with a question that we received from Ferdinand Aranza and ask Dr. Rockmore to address this one. The question is, to what extent does GAO's calculations regarding potential budget gaps take into account GDP growth of the domestic economies of FSM, RMI, and Palau?
Thank you, Ferdinand, for the very good question. So we're not calculating a budget gap. This will require a number of assumptions, including regarding the actual GDP growth in the future. Rather, we're calculating the amount of funds as recorded in the single country audits that are scheduled to expire. So in that sense, this isn't affected by the actual GDP growth. It's not affected by decisions of the government in terms of how their budget is made or how they might change their revenue. So in that sense, it's not directly affected. We actually do not explicitly calculate a budget or fiscal gap, as this is going to depend on what the actual growth is like, what are the actions of the government, what the world context is overall, which would be a number of other factors, assumptions we'd have to consider. I'm hopeful that answered the question, and I'm more than happy to elaborate on that as useful. Thank you, Dr. Ratori.
Thank you so much for that response, and thanks to Ferdinand for the question. A question from Kevin O'Keefe that perhaps Letitia can address. Does the GAO anticipate being tasked with the review of any negotiated compact renewal assistance packages for each of the three FAS prior to U.S. congressional action? Letitia.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. We have not been asked to review specific packages that are being negotiated right now or that are being put together for this negotiation. However, I will say we have had extensive conversations with various congressional committees that are involved regarding our report's findings, and they really are considering what we've outlined and the work that we've done, and they're using that as they think through the parameters. But we have not been asked to review specifically the packages that are being developed prior to the negotiation. So I hope that answers your question. And I hope that there's some hopefulness in the fact that they really have been using our report. Again, we've had so many conversations about the details of it. And in addition to what we have in the report, we've done some additional analyses for these committees just to help them become prepared.
Thank you so much. I think the it's vitally important for people who are making these decisions and people are moving into negotiations to be better educated, informed, and aware. So we appreciate all of the information that allows for more informed decisions and more informed, well-considered negotiations. A question from Dr. Vilina Ratior, Kiniso Chapur, Dr. Ratior, for this question to our GAO presenters. What is the primary reason or cause for the disturbing audit reports of the FSM compared to RMI and Palau? Why is the FSM the only COFA nation that continues to have qualified and adverse opinions? And how will these audit issues negatively impact the compact renegotiations? So several questions there, and I'll toss it to Letitia. Perhaps you can manage those, the responses to those multiple questions.
Actually, I'll turn it over to our expert on internal controls who really dug into these issues. That's Jeff Isaacs.
Well, the issue with the audit opinions, there's one adverse audit opinion, which is considered not a good audit opinion. These are longstanding issues with the Yap Fishing Authority. And they've tried to, and then the complicated issue of accounting issues. And that's the area that there's a problem, the reason for the adverse opinion. I think, I've had discussions, with them, and in terms of resolving it, it's just a challenge in terms of competency, expertise is difficult related to resolving those accounting issues. The other, again, with the qualified opinions as well, they're long-standing issues in terms of leases with the Chuuk State, and they've been working on reconstructing these land lease agreements. So it's been a long process for them to try to remove these audit opinions, working with the auditors. There's a relatively new one with Pohnpei that they're working through, trying to figure out what the best approach with the utilities, issues with the utility corporation. The impact, it's hard to, I'm not in that role in terms of where they weigh these, the accounting reports and opinions. I mean, there's a number of aspects looking at the single audit reports. There's the financial opinion, there's the review of the compliance with the provisions of law and grant agreements. So there's a number of aspects when the senior leaders will look at these things and priorities they will consider. So I'm not sure what the impact, but it's complete information. The reason we provide this as part of this report, to provide complete information which they may consider in making these decisions.
May I just make some remarks in
Sure.
that? Thank you very much, and I thank the questions raised as it pertains to FSM. And I'm mindful and I'm aware of the challenges, as Jeff has pointed out. But I think this is not to make excuses for the country, but I think we need to also look at the trend of how things have been for the past 20 years. We can say that there has been a lot of improvements, and inherent in the audit procedures themselves is probably the issue of capacity building. And this speaks to the core of the compact, that we should be able to stand on our own and build capacity for our people. So while those single audits may point to specific inherent problems within Chuuk State or Pohnpei, I would like to also think that there are positive aspects of the relationship in terms of our capacity going forward.
Let me add this, in terms of our report, we also include more of this scope was for the 5 years, but we did provide in the report a longer perspective in terms of where you come, in terms of the 20 years, in terms of number of audit findings and things. We try to, provide that perspective to the public as well in the report.
Yeah, the other thing I want to also address is the first question by Mr. O'Keefe, asking the question on whether the GAO will be assessing the comeback out, the negotiations outcomes. I think we just need to also acknowledge that the reports from the GAO has been very, very helpful in shaping the course of these compact negotiations going forward. So while that decision obviously rests with the US Congress and the US government, I just want to make sure we acknowledge that these reports are helpful as we move into the negotiation process. Thanks.
Chapur, I see that Ambassador Zacchaeus has his hand up. And you're on mute.
Sorry, I wanted to make a few comments and of course provide some also discussion on some of the key points that were raised. And I'd like to associate myself with some of the comments that my colleague, the Chief of Mission Sorum has made with respect to audits. And I think my statement really did speak to some of these issues. Capacity building is important, but it's also a matter of where the countries prioritize. And when we prioritize, we are being told that this should be our priority. I think that also adds a layer of challenges for us as we try to, especially if different rules are being provided without full discourse. And I think that's an important issue to think about. The question about Geo being asked, and DC and Sorum has answered it quite appropriately on Congress being asking the Geo to do the study. They haven't done yet, and if they should, we will support such a study. But the point I raise is that this study is very important. But as with many studies, the Geo has done a lot of diligent work, professional work, and we've all engaged with it to make sure that we provide the most accurate statements and facts from our sides. But where do they end up, especially when we engage? They're not making the impact that we feel needs to be addressed, because we find that all of us were involved in it. So I'll just like to make that comment that these reports are important. They're independent, they're professionally and diligently carried out. And therefore, I think it's important that we recognize these reports in a partnership that between our countries. Thank you.
Ambassador Zacchaeus, in your remarks, you referenced investment firm's report. We have a question from Jimmy Nguyen. He's wondering if we will have access, or how one might access that report. This is the one with the recommendations for changes to the trust fund committees.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that question. It's a very important question. In the sake of transparency, that report should be published. But having said that, the Marshall Islands will inform the U.S. members that, and if we can share this report with the East-West Center and those that have asked for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two questions from April Herlevy. Have the state or interior departments put forth timetables for compact review as recommended in the Geo report? And the second question, are there any opportunities to consider funding from other U.S. government agencies to meet future budget shortfalls?
I think Jeff, you unmuted. Did you want to answer that before I do?
No, don't go ahead. I can chime in.
Okay, great. Those two questions, have state or interior departments before timetables for compact reviews? I believe you may be referring to the recommendation that we made to Palau to establish their oversight committee. And if so, they've agreed with our recommendation that they would do so, establish that oversight committee, but we don't have, I think, a specific timetable or date when that will happen. And if the question is regarding a different type of compact review, please do let us know and follow up. The second is, are there any opportunities to consider funding from other U.S. government agencies to meet future budget shortfalls? I think there's always considerations. There's various things that congressional members and federal agencies involved in the negotiations can consider. We didn't examine, how other federal assistance programs might fill the gap, but that's something that would be up to the members of the negotiation to consider and to talk about if that were a possibility. And I think also our great representatives from the FAS nations might want to chime in on that. But that's not an issue that we specifically examined, but I think on the table are various opportunities, and the members of those negotiation teams will have to determine what the best approach to filling those gaps might be, to the extent that they've agreed that they do need to be filled. Jeff, did you want to chime in on the first part of that question?
As Leticia, you said that, we don't know of any specific timetable that's been said, but we're very encouraged by the fact that Palau had submitted the three candidates in accordance with the protocol in the compact review agreement. So we're encouraged by that step, and through our discussions with the state that hopefully the next steps will be sooner than later in terms of establishing this important committee advisory group.
I'll make one other note. That committee is due to expire, as Jeff mentioned before. I think it's September 30th, 2023. Jeff, let me know if I've got that date wrong. So they need to actually pull that committee together before its expiration in order to be in compliance with the law. So that's something else that they'll need to consider as they do establish the timeline.
And let me add as well, but they could, if they decide to, they could extend that period of time, the U.S. and Palau as well. And I think it's for in a COVID transition period of time, the impacts on economies would be good to to look at that. We work together, and like the world's working together and dealing with COVID issues and recovery.
So maybe we should turn that over to some of our colleagues, if that's okay, Dr. Ratori, to be able to talk about that second question.
Yes. Mr. Sorum or Ambassador Zacchios, if you'd like to comment on that second question about opportunities to consider funding from other U.S. government agencies or other entities to meet future budget shortfalls.
Yes, I think that's important, and that is definitely something that we are looking into, to look at other sources, and not only within the U.S., but we've also looked at in the case of the trust fund. The trust fund agreement provides for additional contributors, and at the same time, it also provides that the U.S. should also bring contributors. So, and that has not been the case. The Marshall Islands did. So I think to the question, yes, but the U.S. in the case of the trust fund has to step up to bring additional contributors. Of course, the rules and the structure must address the opportunity for others to be willingly able to contribute to it.
I would echo the same sentiments by Ambassador Zacchios. Definitely, I mean that's the nature of how countries work. You seek for other opportunities and other funding sources depending on the needs of the country. So yes, there are other donor partners out there. There are other institutions, international institutions that we've been able to tap, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, and others that are available up there. So in a nutshell, the answer is yes, we will be looking at other opportunities as well.
Thank you. And on the topic of possible future shortfalls, we have a question from Cleo Pascal inviting either the ambassador or DCM to discuss the potential domestic political and or geopolitical effects of a shortfall?
Thank you. I'll take a crack at this. Of course, it's a very important question. It's a question that we're all living with today. We see what is happening. We see what will happen in the Pacific in the coming days, perhaps weeks. But it has, and as I've said before Congress in my statements, there's a lot of pressure for us and for the Marshall Islands to address these important issues with the United States, because there is definitely pressure on it by the people to make sure that the socioeconomic issues of the country and their needs are addressed, and I've spoken to some of those. So yes, definitely that's something that the government is very mindful of. But as I also said, when my president took office, his commitment was to further strengthen the partnership that exists, the special and unique partnership that exists between the United States and the Marshall Islands. That being said, issues of the needs and unresolved issues must be addressed during these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sakias, for those insightful comments. I see the question posed here as two layers, one in looking at the domestic shortfalls, and one the geopolitics of, I'm assuming, the region. In terms of domestically, most definitely there will be impacts and implications. When you have more than half of your budget comes from the compact, and if there are shortfalls, physical shortfalls as referenced by the Geo experts here, there will definitely be problems arising from those. I think in the Geo report, it points to like the state of Chuk, my state of Chuk. 70% of their education sector grants comes from, or education sector comes from the compact. 86% comes from, for health, comes from the compact. So you can see domestically how the physical shortfall will have great impact in the country. Now, with reference to the geopolitics of how things work, I would like to associate myself with the comments also from Ambassador Sakias. And I think this is also important to note. It's the trend of things that happen. If there is a vacuum somewhere, then that vacuum will be filled by some other forces. And I'll just leave it as that. But I think we need to be optimistic that these negotiations, or these compact negotiations, should provide for an opportunity to strengthen the relationships, not diminish it. So if there is a geopolitical shortfall in the region, this is an opportunity to right those things and make it right. I hope that contributes to the answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Richard Pruitt. Even without $0 distributions, I'm concerned that any budgetary shortfalls will necessarily require cutbacks in government services. Such cutbacks could lead to increased out-migration to the United States, putting increased pressure on the welfare net in Hawaii and Guam in particular, causing U.S. taxpayers to have to pay more on the back end than what the U.S. would have paid by plussing up the trust funds up front. Does the GAO look at how Guam and Hawaii are faring financially vis-a-vis the compact impact funding provided them under the compacts?
I can take that question. And what I can tell you is that, yes, actually GAO has conducted a couple of reviews that have examined this issue or aspects of this issue starting back in 2002. But even more recently, in 2020, we issued a report looking at compact migration to Hawaii, Guam, and CNMI, the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, and did identify that, of course, there have been significant numbers of people who have migrated from the compact nations to those three territories. And that did come with financial costs, in particular related to education and healthcare for those who did migrate. We noted in our 2020 report that those Hawaii, Guam, and CNMI started to track and report the financial costs that were related to compact migration or compact impact. And there was a reported estimate totaling for all three, $3.2 billion during the period of 2004 to 2018 associated with the migration of people from the FAS nations to those territories. And they did receive some federal grants to help defray the cost. From 2004 to 2019, Hawaii, Guam, and CNMI as a total received approximately $509 million in federal grants to help defray the cost, obviously not the entire cost. So this is an issue that GAO has studied. I'm happy to send the East-West Center a copy of a couple of those reports, the 2002, but more importantly, the 2020, that outlines what we found related to that issue. And it's one of that those three territories are certainly tracking and reporting on, I think, internally as well. So happy to share that report with the East-West Center to share with you, but it is something that we have examined.
Thank you so much, Letitia. Yes, the June 2020 report entitled Compacts of Free Association Populations in U.S. Areas Have Grown with Varying Reported Effects. We will share that on the event page, but definitely a very thorough report on some of the aspects of compact impact. Yes.
That is it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we will share links to both of these. And I see that we are coming to the end of our time. So I want to thank everyone for the informative presentation from the GAO and our representatives from our COFA nations, DCM, SORUM, and ambassadors Akios. I want to thank our audience for your well-considered, thoughtful questions, and for all of our panelists here for your insightful remarks. I want to thank you for your time, for all of the good work that you are doing in your various areas of service and expertise. And I want to thank Sarah Wang, who has coordinated this on the back end from the East-West Center. Much goes into making these webinars a reality. So I want to thank Sarah and our colleagues in the East-West Center, Washington, DC office. And we will push out links to all of this information and the recording of this session through our social media. So we invite you to follow us there. I want to thank you all very much. Kinisu Chapur and Komal Tata to our COFA representatives. Mahalo. Wish you all a good day, good evening. Thank you.